Hello, my name is Katharine Starr. Thank you for joining us from across the globe for an important and timely conversation. And thank you for joining us via YouTube for today's On the Record program. As a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals that host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. The Chicago Council and the Eurasia Group recently launched the first Atlas of Impunity, a comprehensive index scoring 197 countries and territories on their abuse of power across 5 key societal dimensions. The Atlas is built on 67 statistical indicators drawn from 29 validated sources, including Freedom House, Yale University, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and more. This event is part of a 4-part series of regional discussions in partnership with the Kofi Annan Foundation, an independent nonprofit which works to create a fairer and more peaceful world. Today's discussion will delve into the question, what can a framework of impunity versus accountability tell us about the multidimensional challenges facing the Americas? What are the striking similarities and pitfalls in how governments handle issues like human rights, economic exploitation, and environmental degradation? It is my great honor to introduce today's panelists, who will discuss impunity in the Americas. Louise Arbour served as United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and as Chief Prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and most recently Special Representative to the UN Secretary General for International Migration. She is a former Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada and the Court of Appeal for Ontario. She's currently Special Counsel for Borden Ladner Gervais, LLP, as a board member of the Kofi Annan Foundation. Our next panelist is Mónica Pinto, Professor Emerita of International Law and of International Human Rights Law at the University of Buenos Aires UBA Law School, where she served as Dean from 2010 to 2018. She serves as a member of the governing board of the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights in San Jose. She's Commissioner at the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva, and she sits at the Assembly of the Foundation DeRay Mckesson in Strasbourg. She's also an ad hoc judge at the International Court of Justice, a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and a member of the Committee of Experts on the Application of ILO Conventions and Recommendations. Mónica has held several mandates for the UN in the area of human rights and has published 5 books. Our third guest, DeRay Mckesson, will be joining us later. And so for no further ado, we're going to begin now with our conversation. Mónica, I'd like to start with you. You served on the Atlas of Impunity Advisory Committee as co-chair. Can you speak to the significance of this report and why it's so important to have this impunity versus accountability lens?
Thank you so much, Kathy. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Impunity is going worse in the world, and that's one of the reasons why this publication makes sense. Having the lens of impunity against that of accountability means that you can capture in a better way, we thought, global challenges. Global challenges are not one-sided. They are multidimensional, and whenever you want to target impunity, you have to look to the judiciary and their capacity to render justice, delivering judgments. But at the same time, you have to look how states behave at war, in conflicts and human rights, what they do regarding environment, democracy and accountability. The great majority of countries in the world today speak about democracy, even though they can't sometimes fit the requirements to be a democratic government. However, those speeches that are full of words like justice, democracy, community, accountability, hardly resist the challenge with the practice. So what we propose, what the 2 organizations behind this Atlas propose, and we at the advisory board joined, is just to give a possibility of reading reality at home and abroad from a broader framework. That's why we brought together this Atlas.
I'd like to come in on this issue, first of all, to say this is a wonderful instrument, highly informative. In fact, one can drown in the amount of information that is there. Just a couple of features of the Atlas that I think are really worth highlighting. First, for me, the use of the word impunity was a little challenging. I really had to look at the context, the description in the introduction, because of my own background, but I tend to associate impunity with sort of, personal criminal accountability rather than kind of lack of accountability. So it took me a while to keep in mind that impunity as the chapeau here is used in the sense of power without accountability. So having said that, I think it's also very useful that there are sort of 5 pillars that are being examined, and environmental degradation being one of them, influenced, I think, the poor score of some countries that otherwise would fare very well, like Canada, for instance. So I think it was useful to have these 5 pillars and not just the traditional human rights and democracy kind of angle. The last thing I'd like to say, though, I think one aspect that is important to always keep in mind is that there are limits to comparing countries with each other. It comes as no surprise that the Scandinavian countries fare very well, virtually on all aspects of this. Certainly when I was in the UN human rights system, I always insisted that it is critical to measure countries against themselves and to look at whether a country is progressing, regressing, or in a state of permanent stagnation when it comes to all these kinds of issues. Because otherwise, there's only so much that one can learn by comparing Norway to China, to put it very bluntly. So in addition to this kind of lens, I think it's critical to go back to and to complement that with, for instance, the Universal Periodic Review in the UN human rights system, which measures a country against its own performance, or Crisis Watch in International Crisis Group. So I just wanted to say this is an extremely useful instrument. It's important to insert other tools, I think, to the analysis.
That's an excellent point, Louise. Thank you. I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned there about the environmental degradation being one of those key indicators that we looked at here in the Atlas. Now, environmental degradation is where impunity continues to thrive, even among otherwise accountable societies, such as Canada, which you mentioned. Why is that? And what frameworks do both of you think are necessary to promote and protect human rights, environmental principles, and accountability?
For me?
Let me maybe jump in because I already made the link to Canada.
Go ahead. Go.
Let me. So, as I said, I think it was important to bring in this lens. I have to say, I found the report somewhat charitable to Canada in particular, in the short proposed explanation for the state of affairs. So in the report, I think Canada doesn't fare very well on environmental degradation. But then the commentary says, well, we have to understand that Canada is a very large, and it's all true, very large country where energy is really critical in the winter. I just have to look outside my window to tell you if I didn't have electric heating or internet for that matter, but I wouldn't be talking to you today. So there's sort of charitable explanation. It's also a country that has a history of dependence, not dependency, but reliance, let's put it this way, on fossil fuel that we have in abundance. So exploitation of resources is so entrenched in the economy. So there are explanations. Having said that, first of all, I think it's interesting and important that in an international context, there's a political price to pay for how slow a country like Canada is in its move towards a non-reliance on traditional energy sources. So, but as I said, the explanations or the proposed explanations in the report are what they are. They don't justify anything. and maybe I'll just finish by saying it goes to another idea that I think could be the subject of debate in the report. It often points out that sort of history only goes so far in explaining a state of affairs. States have agency. There's kind of political will, political accountability. This will bring us, I think, to our conversation about, say, the erosion of human rights in otherwise mature democracies, but we could come back to that.
Mónica, did you have anything to add to that topic of environmental degradation?
No, I do agree. I have to say I had the pleasure to work with Louise when she was High Commissioner, and I know of her goals to measure countries against themselves. In fact, what the report shows is that not all countries are bad performers in all the key areas. They have different performances, and whenever you have to gumble them all together, you have their position in the Atlas. Environment is a crucial thing because it depends on our future, the future of next generations. And of course, environment requires a re-adequation of many things, a re-adequation of our personal lives. How do we heat our houses? How do we feed our kids? How do we dress? But at the same time, it needs also a re-adequation of market structures and international relations. I'm not saying anything new when I remember whatever has been said from the Stockholm Declaration onwards, that in fact, environment is a global common. We need everybody on board and no one can be left behind. These are very much pretty words, but what we have to do is just to enforce that. And environment has a big impact in business activities. And that's what I think is being revealed in recent years. We are having more courts having a word to say about how corporations deal with environment issues. We do have new guidelines for states to behave in regard to environment and businesses, and that's the same for corporations. I think that at the end of the day is businessmen and businesswomen want to have their business enjoyed by their kids and the kids of their kids. They have to realize that environment makes part of the future. Environment and human rights. These are things we need every day. And the only possibility for them to have this future and to have new generations enjoying what they have obtained with hard work is just to pay attention to that. That means human rights must not be associated only with undemocratic governments with military rules. Human rights are there every day, and environment is a part of our human rights. So the only possibility is just to take that on board and implement their policies. They can earn money, but they have to earn that money, provided they are not breaching environmental and human rights standards. And I think that's important. And that's one of the main features I think you can see in this atlas. That's why I think that it makes sense having it.
And Mónica, unrest is growing throughout Latin America. We see protests in Peru, Brazil, Chile, Mexico. How has the erosion of trust in democracy and leadership impacted the political landscape, and what are the consequences of this?
Well, Latin America, globally speaking, is made of many countries with different profiles, but generally speaking, the great majority just recovered democracy starting in the 80s. And in this part of the world, democracy came together with the human rights speech. In fact, every country fashioned that speech according to its own profile. So even when we are sharing common standards and even common legal rules, because all our countries are state parties to the American Convention on Human Rights, which has a court, and the court has put forward an interpretation of those rules requiring that past violations of human rights had to be the object of investigation. You have to prosecute those prima facie responsible. You have to convict them if they are guilty, and you have to provide compensation for the victims. In fact, people in our part of the world not only want democracy and human rights in order to have those military tried. They want democracy because they want a job, they want education, they want health, they want decent food, they want environment respect. And that depends very much in the way in which governments are working. So you have countries like Uruguay, which is the best student in our part of the world, and you have others whose performance varies a lot in the different key areas. You mentioned Brazil. Brazil had in the previous government of President Lula a growing middle class, which invested in education and in health. Nowadays, Brazil has, perhaps it also had at that time, but Brazil has today a sort of systematic corruption. It has white-collar crimes, and that downloads even the good policies, public policies that had been put forward. There was a very interesting and sustainable agricultural policy that in fact did not succeed as it should have done because of these other elements in the context, in the landscape. A country like Chile, which is on the opposite side in terms of political colors, in Chile you still have people that want, okay, we keep that democracy, but we want health and education because that's very expensive in our part of the region and we need that. On the other hand, you have Mexico, which is the big country in the north part of Latin America. And the point with Mexico, which is I would say, actually being the victim of many different, this is a true example of multidimensional challenges, Mexico, because on the one hand, you have a high level of discrimination, you have drug-related crimes, and you have also very high rates of crimes. So, in fact, the results, the positive results of Mexico are balanced because of that. And of course, as we have the best in the region, we have the worst in the region, which is Maduro and Venezuela. There you have the big point. Venezuela is just the big example of impunity. And impunity has a very short explanation. President Maduro knows that if ever he opens the door to accountability, the first to go to an international tribunal will be himself. But he's not the only one. Look at Nicaragua and Ortega, who has put in jail all his political opponents, and so he wins the elections very easily. And also look at Haiti, which is a combination of the poorest country in the region, the country which is the victim of the big, I would say, natural disasters, but at the same time, its performance is not good. So I think putting up together, and just to close the question you put to me, I think that the Atlas gives tools for the society to monitor what's going on, to be aware how things are getting worse or better. And at the same time, it provides the opportunity of a debate for the society to follow these key areas and say, okay, we are going better, we are not.
I think one of the interesting things about the Atlas is that it does give, lay the groundwork for a debate about the future of the country, but it also looks at the history of countries and how the history can shape the way that the country is developing now and into the future. Louise, I wanted to start with you about this idea of history and legacy. Now, the legacies of colonialism and the slave trade are correlated with higher impunity scores in the Atlas. How do you explain this prevalence?
Well, that's the Atlas doesn't provide a lot of explanation. It describes a state of affairs. So this is a very tough question because I can't turn to the Atlas and flip around. In fact, it poses the question. I have to say I was a little taken aback when I first read at the beginning of the report. There's several correlations that are made, and that's one of them. So what I read was that 20 countries with the highest score of impunity, so that's the whole package, right? Human rights violation, unaccountable governance, environmental degradation, conflict, taking the 5 pillars, 20 countries with the highest, so the worst performance, are former colonies. That's just a correlation that is made. So you might ask, is that a coincidence, or what can we draw from that, is essentially your question. Essentially, what I have to I don't know what we could draw from that. I could give you an intuitive reaction, which is, well, that's not surprising. I think the legacy of the kind of abuse that was visited on these countries by colonial models, it was so profound that it's not surprising that whatever time frame has elapsed since independence for these countries, that there's still a very profound trace of deficiencies. Having said that, I thought to myself, well, that's really interesting that the report makes a correlation between essentially bad performance on accountability issues with former colonies, but it doesn't ask whether there's any correlation of bad performance of the former colonizers, which I thought would be quite interesting to look at as well. On that, a superficial answer would be, well, actually, they are not doing too well because the best performers in that report are European countries, and many of them were colonial powers. It's not a very helpful observation, but if one were to dig a little more deeply onto these issues, it might actually be interesting to see, what are the traceable legacies on the abusers? And I think racial discrimination and the current resistance to migratory, to human mobility and migration, I think is somewhat linked to very widespread views of some people as more deserving than others, I think, to put it very crudely and very bluntly. And so I don't know what the answer is. I don't know why 20 of the worst performers are former colonies, but I'd be very interested in people digging deeper into the traceable history of the current performance of what I would call the colonial abusers. Some have, I think, risen. Certainly, they've benefited economically. Another correlation there is, again, maybe not all that surprising, but generally speaking, rich countries fare better than poor countries. Again, this is not a huge surprise. It's not generalized. The US, for instance, another observation is that great powers are not that great on that measurement of power without accountability. They may fare very well on accountable governance, but very poorly in the case of the US, for instance, on crime and violence, racial discrimination, very much linked to history, if not of colonialism, but certainly of the slave trade. So these correlations are there. I can't provide the answer, but I think it's there again an observation that history accounts, or historical circumstances account for part of the current reality, but agency, including kind of political will and ability, capacity to address these kinds of issues, play a part, which is the most important, or weighs the more between history and current agency. I think it varies country by country. That's why we have to come back to examining. Let me just come to the best performers, the Scandinavian countries. So on all these pillars, they overall fare better than anybody else. But if you look at them, they are, for the most part, not heavily populated countries. I mean, Sweden, the largest with 10 million, but Norway, Finland, you're talking 5-6 million people. Up to now, quite homogeneous, and in a sense anchored in their own reality, constitutional monarchies, a very widespread state religion with low observance, but a lot of homogeneity. I think these countries are going to start struggling on the issue of migration. They are already. The disturbance of this homogeneous political consensus that comes from the influx of, quote, foreigners is very much part, I think, of the challenge that North America is facing today. We are doing very badly, both the US and Canada, in my opinion, in facing the inevitable and necessary influx of newcomers in our country, in our economy. We're very bad. This is, I think, on human rights issues, very typical. This is an issue for the first time that countries like Europe and North America are facing something that's hard for them to do. We're very good at telling others to do something that's hard for them to do, like gender equality, lots of issues that, for them is a big leap forward into modern world and values. But when we're asked to do something that's hard for us to do, we're not that good at it. And I think the question of immigration, migration generally is going to stay with, certainly in North America, with a currently unresolved, very big challenge.
Before we change over to questions from the audience, then I'd like to kind of end on maybe a more hopeful question. Are there any examples of successful efforts to address impunity and promote accountability in the Americas? And are there any lessons that we're learning?
If I may, I think we do have, but again, this is that does not lead to have a very good performer in all the areas. I mentioned a moment ago Uruguay as the best ranked in the region. However, if you take into consideration, Uruguay had a military rule, as we all had in this part of the world. They didn't set up an inquiry commission. They didn't have judicial proceedings in order to try those responsible. They didn't pay reparations. But at the end of the day, they have a very stable democracy. They set up stable institutions, and they have chosen a political economy which fits their population. Again, as Louise pointed out a moment ago, Uruguay is a small country. It's smaller than the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina, and we do have 24 provinces here. So, and they're very much homogeneous, as she said. On the other side, you do have other countries that have done well in the area of fighting against impunity because of the past violations of human rights. My country, Argentina, is one of them, because we have been just inquiring and trying people for a very long time, and the day will come when we will close those proceedings, and in fact, perhaps that's a good explanation of Argentina being so close to the U.S. in the ranking, which surprised me a lot when I saw it for the first time. Because once democracy was back, we established democratic rules, and in putting aside the better or worse quality of current and past governments, the point is that we had democratic institutions all over through 1983, which was not the feature in the country from the beginning. So the point, I think, is that sometimes in some of our countries, democratic institutions, the fight against impunity, the respect of human rights, trying to put together rules regarding accountability and the way in which we manage conflicts, social conflicts, and human rights conflicts, put together in the good path. The point is, of course, that we have to strengthen our institutions. What lacks generally in America, and that's an explanation perhaps to your question of the different countries, is that in this part of the world, people is more important than institutions. And that's a problem. We have to start having faith in institutions and not only in men and women. But I do think we are going better. There are optimist examples in the Atlas that may be followed and that are not so high examples like the Scandinavian, but that are targeted here and there, whose policies have resulted and are successful. Yes, they are.
Katie, let me just jump in. I think this is a very important idea. The question of what is more important, people or institutions. Obviously, ideally, we should have extremely well-constructed institution led and staffed by extremely talented, great people. Yeah, so that would be it. But if not, I think there should be a concern about the erosion of public trust in democratic institutions, all of them. There's erosion of public trust shockingly, in my view, in electoral processes, which is one of the mechanism of democratic governance. When that starts, it's very hard to roll back. I mean, you see it in virtually every election in Africa, that the losers, the minute the votes are in, the losers denounce the process as corrupt or inadequate or unfair. We haven't seen a lot of that, I think, in our own systems. It's been right up front in the US. And now in Canada, the current conversation as we speak is about the necessity of a public inquiry into foreign interference. So there's, in the US, allegations that were clearly untrue and shockingly promoted about domestic interferences in electoral processes. And now there's a lot of public suspicion about the integrity of the electoral process. That's very concerning. There's also a lot of concerns, I think, about the integrity of judicial institutions, allegedly being overtaken by people's political agenda. So judges coming in with kind of political personal agenda. We see these claims being made in the US. So the slow erosion of really fundamental institutions that rely on public trust for the functioning of democracy, I think, is very concerning, certainly in North America today.
Now, I'd like to get some questions in from our audience watching us today. And one question actually gets at exactly what you've been talking about here, Louise, in terms of that distrust in institutions. A big part of that distrust, some critics say, have been fueled by the media and social media. So how can these two groups, the media and social media, help promote transparency and accountability? And what are the risks of both media and social media here?
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, mine was a very general observation, is that in fact, media and social media also, but media is a crucial actor in political arena. Let's say media can help to restore peace in many situations, but at the same time, it can put over the table lots of questions. So we are very, very well aware of the importance of having freedom of expression and having democratic media. That means also they do have their accountability and their responsibility. And social media is a way of organizing people. I do have for myself, and at that time I was also working for the UN in a board of trustees on technical cooperation, that the Arab Spring was organized because of social media. Young people had access to social media. They lacked any job. They were poor, and they always had the same government ruling them. So they organized through social media, and that's what we have today. Perhaps that was one of the most spontaneous activity or event we had in recent years, and the the fact that it was so spontaneous meant that they were lacking a plan B. They didn't have a second best, as we always should have in order to move forward. But I think that first, social media today and media, but social media means that everybody has a smartphone. And so whatever you are doing in the public arena may be captured by one of these phones. And so that helps transparency. At the same time, that means that those that are acting in the political arena, in the public arena, should be very cautious when they open their mouths. The point is that you cannot speak here and there without any responsibility in what you are saying. So I think that the role of media is a role that has been studied by constitutionalists, but those dealing with political science from the mid-18th century. And it grows up with the time, with technology. And social media means a sort of democratization, decentralization of this capacity of media to have a big eye on the society. Of course, it can be biased, but because it can be biased, you always have social media to answer whatever has been said about you. But that means that we should be clever when doing things, because we are being monitored, and the monitoring is by the society.
Louise, did you have any thoughts to add?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have great insight. In a sense, I think the concern I think we have to have is that it's the ultimate, social media, ultimately, you might argue, is the ultimate expression of democracy, where everybody's equal, everybody has a voice, it's freedom of expression, unbridled, I don't know if that's a word, unrestricted, so it's at the crossword of democratic and human rights ideals of freedom and so on. The reality, I think, is very different. In a society where so much progress in our world, in our contemporary world, is anchored in science, the contempt for the contribution of science by people whose opinion, based on nothing but their own prejudices, and in lots of cases, ignorance or interest in advancing their political power, for that to be on par with the quality that is produced by the sophisticated education systems we have in science. I mean, when you look at the anti-vax movement and the reliance that we have as modern societies in the rich countries on the advancement that science has brought to our well-being, to healthcare and so on, is so it comes back to ultimate rights and goods not being absolute, freedom of expression completely unchecked. I think is not good. It has to. That's where the rule of law comes in, I think.
That's it.
Speaking of the rule for law, we have a question from an audience member here. Why is rethinking and strengthening the rule of law critical for accountability?
Well, let me just, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll say it in very general terms. I think that answers the issue that Mónica was referring to before about the tension between people and institutions. I think when people design a system of law that has all the features of what we understand to be the rule of law, that is excluding arbitrariness, equality before the law, equality under the law, equal protection and benefit of the law, equal impartial, equal enforcement of the law. If these are institutionalized, and I have to say, it's really important to understand the rule of law in a substantive way, not just a procedural way, not rule by law, any law, fiscal laws that produce inequalities that are unjust. So if we construct societies in which just laws are justly enforced, to me, that's the best guaranteed, even if there are deficiencies in what we consider to be democratic processes. I think we're on much better track.
Monica?
I do agree completely. I think rule of law is the landscape. We should be there. It provides institution. It provides for democratic institutions. It provides for equality and human rights. It provides for transparency, and it provides for the struggle against impunity and accountability.
All right. I'd like to ask one final question here from our audience, a takeaway. So quickly, in a sentence or so, how would you sum up what the most important thing to take away from this atlas is for our listeners and readers of this project?
If you want, I start. I think that the Atlas has an added value to all the existing, because you mentioned, Kathy, when we started, we are relying on others' work in different areas of the world. What the Atlas does is that it puts together a sort of toolkit in which you have different instruments that allow you to be more targeted in certain issues. And that provides for the civil society and for the institutions in a country to try to follow the situation. And at the same time, the government, but also the civil society, the people can engage in public debate on that. Let's say, in that way, it may also be a sort of prevention instrument. You can follow the situation and you can predict what will be the end of the road if ever you continue in that sense, or if ever you have to introduce changes. So I think it's provided a different reading, which is complementary to others and which adds to democratic governance.
Louise?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it's an aggregate of a lot of data from a lot of different sources. It gives the possibility to dig pretty deep into the profile. So just the big ranking is useful as far as it goes, but it doesn't really matter. There's some surprises, how some countries have fared and others, but to be able through that to access this wide range of information, digging deeper into each country, I think is extremely helpful. And it will force people to look at these correlations. Some are more visible than others, and ask questions, why is Senegal faring better than the US on human rights issues? Interesting. Interesting. So I think it's a very rich instrument for policymakers, for people who believe that knowledge, that verifiable knowledge, is fundamental for public policy and political choices.
Thank you so much, Louise and Monica. We really appreciate your time here today. Thank you to everyone around the world joining us this morning. This discussion is part of a 4-part series of regional discussions in partnership with the Kofi Annan Foundation. Next week on March 7th, join Nada Al-Nashif, Mark Malik Brown, Suzanne Maloney, and Ghassan Salameh virtually as they look at the rule of law and accountability in the Middle East and North Africa. Details and the chance to sign up for this event are all available at globalaffairs.org. Again, thank you so much to our panelists, Monica and Louise. We really appreciate your time today. And we encourage everyone to dig deep into the Atlas, as Louise said, and pull out some of that really interesting data. Thank you so much and have a great day.